Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh Live, your home for Pittsburgh Penguins news and analysis. You can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh or anywhere you get your podcast from. We came on here live today, and really, I want to know, what do you guys want to talk about? Because it's been quiet, except for one little trade that was made this afternoon by the Penguins. And I should also say, they signed a left-handed defenseman that is going to be at camp and that is going to be potentially somebody you see at the NHL level next season. But we all know the biggest storyline today, and that is the fact that the Penguins have swapped top prospects with the Winnipeg Jets, acquiring Rutger McGroarty from the Jets in exchange for Brayden Yager per Elliot Friedman of Sportsnet. I'm going to dive into all of my thoughts, everything that I believe and I think coming out of this massive trade, where it leaves the Penguins, what it does for them this season, what it does for them going into the future. But I also want to know, as I threw in here with the pinned comment, for everybody that is watching live on YouTube, what are your thoughts on this trade by the Pittsburgh Penguins? I'll give mine. I want to hear some of yours as well. But it was a very interesting day. Whenever that first tweet came from Elliot Friedman, that was hearing the Penguins are going to be working on acquiring Rutger McGroarty, nothing done yet. And then it comes out later that it's Brayden Yager. And then it comes out later from Frank Saravalli of Daily Faceoff that the trade is 1-for-1. Anytime you see that in that direct quotation, you know it's a big deal. And it is a big deal for both sides of this thing. Rutger McGroarty was in a very public dispute with the Winnipeg Jets, whereas he wanted to play at the NHL level. He didn't like the development path that the Jets were putting him on, so he requested a trade. There were a lot of teams that had interest, or at the very least had checked in on this current situation with Rutger McGroarty. And then at the end of the day, the Penguins are the team that ends up going out and getting the 20-year-old top prospect of the Winnipeg Jets. And all it cost them was a top prospect of their own in Brayden Yager. Let me start with Yager before we get into McGroarty and the future of him with the Penguins. Brayden Yager was, and up to this day, the Penguins' best prospect, bar none. It was not close. It was not going to be close. I liked Tanner Howe. I liked Harrison Brunick, but neither of them were close to how good of a prospect Brayden Yager was. He was the number one guy, and he had been growing exponentially year over year for the past couple of seasons. Right now, he's projected to finish out as top 6 center, potentially a second line center. And I think that there's a chance that he goes even more than that. He's 19 years old. He was a guy that loved being a Penguins prospect. He loved the work that he was getting done with Tom Kostopoulos and Matt Cullen over video chat and any of the Penguins trainers that they sent out to Moose Jaw. He was a guy that I was very excited for. Some of us were banging the table for him to get an opportunity to, at the very least, get a 9-game sample size, that 9-game tryout at the beginning of this season. Well, at the end of the day, that's no longer a storyline going into camp, because instead they trade him away in exchange for Rutger McGroarty, who we'll talk about here in a second. It is insane that they pulled this deal off. It is another massive August trade by Kyle Dubas. He's 2 for 2. Everybody remembers that early August of last year was the Erik Karlsson deal. Now in late August, he goes out and get the 33rd ranked prospect, according to The Athletic, in the entire National Hockey League, and a prospect that, as we'll discuss, is going to be in black and gold this season. So let's get into it. My overall thoughts, it's a gamble. But then again, it is a 20-year-old in Rutger McGroarty and a 19-year-old in Brayden Yager that were exchanged in this deal. Nothing is a given at this current stage of things. Yes, we know what they've been in their respective areas of amateur hockey. Yager being in the WHL up in Canada, and Rutger McGroarty coming from Michigan of the NCAA, as well as the United States National Development Program. But nothing's a given as to what they're going to look like at the National Hockey League level. I mentioned, McGroarty is the 33rd best prospect ranked by The Athletic. Yager was 58th. But the biggest thing here for the Penguins is they're trying to expedite this. They won't say it. I'll say it. They're trying to expedite this rebuild, right? Kyle Dubas is trying to stand in both worlds. That is not an easy thing to do. He's trying to improve the future of the Pittsburgh Penguins while also making the team on the ice as competitive as humanly possible out of respect for Evgeny Malkin, Chris Letang, Erik Karlsson, and of course, Sidney Crosby. Most of this summer was leaning towards the future, right? Anytime you bring in Kevin Hayes and a second-round pick for future considerations and then flop that second-round pick for another second-round pick and a third-round pick and a pick swap, these are all moves that lean towards the future. Not to say Kevin Hayes won't help them this year, but more so they wanted that trade done because they wanted the draft capital. They wanted the picks and the pieces that they can build the future of the organization with. That's been most of this summer. There have been some that are down the middle. I'll throw Blake Lizotte into that one. That's basically it, right? But this one is one where he's firmly standing. By he, I mean Kyle Dubas is trying to firmly stand in both worlds. McGroarty is 20 years old, which means he could be a long-term answer for the Penguins and a really good long-term answer for the Penguins for years to come. But he's also going to contribute this season. He is going to be a guy that comes into camp with an opportunity to not just make the opening night roster, but an opportunity to be in the top 6 right off the bat. As soon as this trade went down, Nick Horwat, who is currently indisposed, traveling, the world traveler, he immediately said he's going to play with checks notes Sidney freaking Crosby. And there's a good chance that he does. There's a very good chance that the Penguins just traded for their first line left wing. They just traded for their Jake Gensel substitute. And it cost them their first overall prospect. It cost them their best prospect. But I would say 1-for-1 right now. Personally, McGroarty is one further along, much further along than Brayden Yager. And I think the ceiling is a little bit higher as well. Not to say that it won't flip-flop, because again, it's a 20-year-old and a 19-year-old. I can't stress that enough. But I do think that McGroarty raises the ceiling as far as what you're getting out of your top prospect heading into this season. Let's look at the measurables for Rutger McGroarty. 6'1", 205 pounds. Immediately, you look at that and say, yeah, he's ready to go up against men in the NHL. This is a guy that plays with a little bit of that nastiness, that plays with a little bit of that edge, and I think Penguins fans are going to love that about him. Not only that, he's a playmaker. He's a guy that is a good skater. It's not going to be the highlight of his game, but the highlight of his game is going to be that he's an underrated facilitator, and Scott Wheeler of The Athletic highlights that in his little blurb that he wrote whenever he put out his top 100 prospects. This is what Scott Wheeler of The Athletic had to say about the newest member of the Pittsburgh Penguins, Rutger McGroarty. Quote, he's a better skater. It doesn't look like the prettiest through his first few steps, but there's some power when he gets going nonetheless than he gets credit for. And his spatial awareness, reads, and effort level help him to avoid losing short foot races. He's got great hands, a feel on the puck as a passer. His finishing touch around the net is there in spades with a hard one-touch shot that he leverages his strong frame to power through when he gets open in the slot. He's always been a sneaky good facilitator who passes the puck really well and can hold on to it if need be. That sounds great, right? This is a top 40 prospect in the NHL for a reason. There's a lot to get excited about with Rutger McGroarty. You look at what he was able to do at Michigan the last 2 seasons, 75 games played, 34 goals, 91 points on a very, very good Michigan Wolverines team. But not only that, guys, the Penguins traded for Captain America. He was Team USA's captain at World Juniors this past year, leading them to gold with 9 points in 7 games. I'm excited. And as everybody has thrown into the chat here, it stinks that they had to give up Brayden Yager. It does. I liked Yager. I really was excited to see his progression because, like I mentioned at the top of this show, Brayden Yager is a prospect that from his draft year to the year after, which was last year, to even where he's at right now and what the expectations are for him right now, he has grown exponentially. And I would assume that that growth continues for Brayden Yager. So it's unfortunate that that's going to continue with another organization. But you have to realize that when you're trading a top prospect that might be ready in 2 years, considering where the Penguins are at with their organization, where they want to be competitive as possible this year, next year, especially when Evgeny Malkin has those final 2 years on his contract, and then who knows where the Crosby stuff comes after that. I'm sure that'll come in the questions part. But this team wants to be competitive. Bringing in a young guy like this, it's not without risk. It's not without gamble. but it certainly elevates the ceiling for this year. And you're going to have to pay something to get something. And while, yes, the one thing that I looked at in this and why I expected there to be more added to this, maybe a 4th or 5th round pick coming back the Penguins' way because McGroarty was not going to play for that organization this year, there might have been a bidding war. I find it hard to believe there wasn't a bidding war. This is a very exciting prospect that doesn't shake loose very often. And it's honestly very intriguing because it might be the second piece of this starting to happen more often. We saw Cutter Gauthier with the Philadelphia Flyers going from the Flyers over to the Ducks last year because he wasn't happy. Now we see Rutger McGroarty going from the Jets to the Penguins because he wasn't happy. This might start a new trend for young prospects, but historically, this has not been a player. This has not been a prospect, a level of prospect that has been up for grabs at this stage of his development. So it's a very exciting opportunity for McGroarty. It's a very exciting opportunity for the Pittsburgh Penguins. And it's a very exciting time for Sidney Crosby because he might be getting a really good young winger that immediately elevates the level of that line. Now, why am I so excited? Because while Yager was great, and he was going to be great again for Moose Jaw this year, McGroarty is going to be good for the Penguins. I've said that countless times already in this show. It's somebody who immediately becomes the best young player the Penguins have seen since Jake Gensel. Not to say that he's ever going to reach that level, because there's a chance that he doesn't. But the upside is there. The pedigree is there. The talent is there. And the frame is there as well. Like I mentioned, 6'1", 205. And unlike a guy like Ryan Graves, McGroarty knows how to use it. He has a little bit of attitude too, which I think is going to go a long way with the Pittsburgh Penguins organization. So it's very exciting. As far as where he fits, let me first read you what Kyle Dubas had to say on this trade, on this acquisition of Rutger McGroarty. Quote, "We had a difficult decision to make with this trade because we hold Brayden Yager in such a high regard as a person and a prospect. After much consideration, we decided that the opportunity to add Rutger McGroarty was ultimately in the best interest of the Penguins. He possesses a combination of ability, leadership, and competitiveness that the Penguins need to achieve our goals in the short and long run. We look forward to welcoming Rutger and his family to the city of Pittsburgh and the Penguins." And that's exactly what they'll do. He'll show up in training camp. He'll play with some of the best players on the Penguins, and he'll make the roster out of camp. That was the big snafu with Winnipeg, so I have a hard time believing the Penguins, who, by the way, immediately signed him to his 3-year ELC, which will cost $950,000 against the salary cap this year. I would expect he ends up starting the year at the NHL level. And as Hunter Hodes, who I know is jumped in here, appreciate you, Hunter. Hunter Hodes mentioned to me, this is a guy that can play up and down the lineup too. While he does top out as potentially being a guy that plays in the top 6 for the Penguins, this is a guy that could bump down, play some hard third line minutes. This is a guy that could bump down, hopefully not, but play some fourth line minutes if need be. The Penguins, able to go out there, get a really good player. It's going to cost you something. I'm sure there was a bidding war. Otherwise, it would have gotten the Penguins something else back in return. Obviously, the Boston Bruins were involved, and I'm sure some other teams were as well. But at the end of the day, I like the move by Dubas. I think it helps the team this year and next. It's a gamble, but it always is going to be. And you just hope that it pays off. You hope that Rutger McGroarty has a more fruitful NHL career, and you hope that he's able to help the Penguins elevate where they're at from the top 6, and who knows, maybe even get some power play time by the end of the year. Let's not jump the gun on that one. This kid hasn't even stepped foot on the ice in Pittsburgh. So that answers a couple of the questions that were in the comment section here. I'll answer everybody else's question as we move on about this trade, about anything else that you want to ask surrounding the Pittsburgh Penguins, as we're still about a month away from the open of training camp up in Cranberry. And let's start with Wes's. He says, would you have rather seen Owen Pickering traded in this instead of Brayden Yager? I would have. I consider Owen Pickering, I mean, I can tell you right now, because I have my top 10 prospects in this file that I'm using for this. I have Owen Pickering, I believe, at 6 or 7 in the Penguins prospect rankings. Why can I not find it at the moment? Oh, well, I would have. I would have rather seen Owen Pickering. I understand the Penguins are very light when it comes to defensive prospects, but Brayden Yager, like I mentioned, was far and away the top prospect the Penguins had. If they could have held on to him and get McGroarty, then I think it would have been hands down, no questions asked, an unmitigated success for Kyle Dubas. Great Wall asks, so McGroarty was requesting a trade and there were rumors that he had demands about ice time, but everything I've seen since the trade is that he's a character guy and great in the locker room. That is mostly the talk about Rutger McGroarty. I mean, he was the captain of the gold medal Olympic, or not Olympic team, excuse me, the gold medal World Juniors team last year for Team USA. He was requesting a trade because he didn't agree with the route in which the Jets wanted him to take to getting ice time at the NHL level. From what I saw, he wasn't excited about the prospect of playing at the American Hockey League level. Obviously, he played at Michigan with a lot of NHL talent. Some of that talent late last year went directly to the NHL level and played for the teams that drafted them, signed their 3-year ELCs, got their feet wet last year at the NHL level. McGroarty didn't. Then again, the Jets were a playoff team. He was not really excited, from what I've seen and what was reported, about the prospect of starting in the AHL. So with that, that's why you expect him to be in the NHL for the Penguins at the start of this season. Not only that, but he does have the talent and the capability to do so, especially on a Penguins team that had a lot of question marks. And this is another question mark, but this is a question mark with a much higher ceiling of possibility than what they had previously. Let's look and answer again any questions that you guys have. Throw them in the chat, whether it's about this, whether it's about anything else surrounding the Pittsburgh Penguins right now, as everybody's given up their thoughts on this trade, which I absolutely love. Negative Pressure Point says Tanner Howe is his childhood friend too. I hope it doesn't affect either of them too much. And of course, Tanner Howe is very close to Brayden Yager. Yager said that he was on a fishing boat whenever Howe was drafted, and he jumped up in excitement that Howe was going to the Penguins, immediately called him, said, "You're going to love it there. It's great. They handled everything great for me so far since I've been drafted." That's the other side of things. It seemed like Brayden Yager was so excited to become a member of the Penguins NHL team. It seemed like he was excited to be a member of the Penguins prospect system. Obviously, he goes to Winnipeg, a team that right now is set up to be good right now and potentially into the future. They have a lot of really good young talent, including a guy like Cole Perfetti up there. So he joins a good opportunity in Winnipeg. Tanner Howe, I'm sure, Negative Pressure Products, I'm sure Tanner Howe is still extremely excited to be a member of the Penguins organization. I don't think this changes much for him. Obviously, it's probably a damper on it, but I still think he's excited to be part of this organization, I would have to imagine. Bonehead says, love the name, what's the point of this trade? I could see if we got McGroarty to go along with Yager, but I'm not sure otherwise. Between the Pens and the Steelers, I'm about ready to give up on those teams. Obviously, the Steelers, there's a lot that goes into that one. That's a loaded question. But what's the point of this trade? The Penguins want to be able to be good now and into the future. Yager wasn't going to be able to help them be really good now this year, potentially not next year. Again, that would have been a question to reassess after this season, whereas McGroarty, day one, he comes in and he could potentially be on your top six. He could potentially be right on the wing next to Sidney Crosby, and he won't look out of place. So that's the point of it. It's Kyle Dubas trying to play the middle as best he can. It feels like there might have been a little bit of pressure from above that, hey, this team on paper is not looking, as good as we had hoped whenever you were trying to play the middle. Maybe go out there and make a big move, and he did. You have to pay a lot to get a lot, and they got a really good, solid prospect that could be ready this year for a prospect that is also solid, but he's not going to be ready this year and might not be ready next year, depending on how he progresses through this season. Flux says, after this move, we're even more overloaded at forward. Josh Yohe said that people in the organization expect him to play in the NHL. How many moves do you expect are still to come before the season starts? That's hard. It feels like there is another move coming. Again, that's just a gut feeling. That's not going off of anything else other than it just feels to me personally that there is another move coming for the Penguins. I think it's a center one because you look at where they're at center. Obviously, Crosby, Malkin, it's been that way for 18 years. It's going to be that way again this season. Miss me with that Malkin moving to wing stuff. It's not happening this year. Maybe next year we'll have to wait and see. But they have Crosby, Malkin. They have Eller. They have Hayes. They have Achari. They have Lizotte. Beauvillier can play center. I'm trying to think of who else I missed. Sam Poulin plays center. Jonathan Gruden can play center. Vasily Ponomarev can play center. Not Tanner Glass. Dang, I got through the first one. Cody Glass, not Tanner Glass, can also play center. They're overstocked. And they're a team right now that, well, yes, they want to be better at the NHL level this season. They're also making a lot of moves that kind of make it look like they're a rebuilding team. So it feels like there's a center trade coming. If I'm predicting and I'm guessing, that's where I'm going with it. That's what I would think happens. Of course, we talked a couple days ago about Nick Robertson and the potential of an offer sheet, or even the potential of a straight up trade, because he still has a trade request in for the Toronto Maple Leafs. I don't think this rules that out, although it would get, as you said here, Flux, very, very crowded, especially on the left side, because you still have Michael Bunting, who's going to be a top 6 guy. Honestly, it's hard to imagine them removing him from Evgeny Malkin's wing. And they also have, Drew O'Connor. Where does he fit in all this? Obviously, all summer long, we've been saying, if you can add somebody that bumps O'Connor down to the third line, that is picture perfect. That's exactly what you want. That is chef's kiss. Great for the bottom 6, because O'Connor brings everything that he did last year, added scoring, a little bit of added speed, and he's trying to add that net front presence, that net front scoring that he kind of saw an example of late in the season with Michael Bunting. If you can get that out of a third line left wing, that's better than you've gotten in the last couple of years, and that is great for the Penguins. So again, do I think there's another trade coming? Yes. If I had to predict and I had to assume, not assume, I don't like that. If I had to predict from where I'm sitting, it would be a center trade, either Eller or Achari. Eller is the easier of the two to move. Evan says, could the Penguins have maybe instead traded Sam Poulin and a pick or two? Would this deal have been possible? Because in my opinion, it's preferable. It's always preferable to keep your top prospect. And that was Brayden Yager. If they could have, they probably would have. But I have a hard time believing that the Winnipeg Jets were going to send McGroarty to the Penguins for anything less, right? They probably had offers from other teams. This is probably the offer they wanted from the Penguins. And they said, if you don't want it, we'll take it somewhere else. Because that's how much people like Rutger McGroarty at this stage of his career. That's how valuable he is at this stage of his career. Would I have preferred, would the Penguins have preferred it to be, Poulin and a pick or two? Probably. I like Sam Poulin. As we've all mentioned, this is a do or die season for him. A pick or two is probably, you're thinking a high value pick and maybe a throw in like a 5th and a 2nd or a 5th and a 1st, especially considering it was Yager. It probably has to be a 1st. Then you're giving up 3 assets for 1, and that's even more of a gamble. Right now, at least your gamble is you just need McGroarty to be better than Yager, and you get the upside of him being ready now and playing in year 20 of Sidney Crosby instead of playing in year 23 or 24 of Sidney Crosby, or even 22. I don't want to, project out that far for Yager, but that's the risk you're willing to take. If you add those other picks, that's the only other thing. It's preferable, but you're also upping the amount of risk you're taking on, because it's so many other pieces that could go right for Winnipeg, where you're only getting one opportunity with McGroarty in Pittsburgh, even though that opportunity looks like it's going to be very good. Let's scroll down through here, and it seems like everybody is saying they really like this trade. Ryan wants to know, where does this move put Valtteri Puustinen in this lineup? And it's interesting because right now it is tough to project what the lineup is going to be, because there's been so many moves. There have been so many, there's been so much turnover for the Penguins. But friend of the show, Doug Gladkey, texted me and said, listen, what do you think the lines are? Best guess at the Penguins forward lines as it stands today. And I tried to put some rough thoughts on it, and I'll give that to you here as well, especially since the question about Puustinen came up. And I love Valtteri Puustinen. I've stood on the table for Valtteri Puustinen many times, but I think this bounces him out of the lineup at least to start. I think there's still an opportunity for him to try to get in there, but without another trade, it bounces him out to start, in my opinion. Rough thoughts on a lineup for now, and you guys can react to this however you'd like. I put Rutger McGroarty on the first line to start. McGroarty, Crosby, Rust. I like that to start. Bunting, Malkin, Raquel. That was a good second line for you down the stretch. A big part of the reason they went 8-1-3 down the stretch. Love that. O'Connor, Eller, Hayes. You bring a little bit of added facilitation from Hayes on the wing. You get O'Connor to bump down. I think that's a better third line than you had last year. You still have Lars Eller in the middle. He is the best third line center you've had since Nick Bonino round 1. So O'Connor, Eller, Hayes is my third line as of right now, even though I predict that there might be another trade, which might bump one of those two guys out of there. And then I would put Lizotte, Glass, and Achari on the fourth line. Bumps Beauvillier out, bumps Puustinen out, adds a guy like McGroarty, and I almost said it again, I do like Cody Glass as your fourth line center to start the season. Again, I don't know much about Cody Glass. He's a bottom 6 guy right now. He's going to have to earn it. So is McGroarty for that matter, but I think McGroarty comes in with a little bit more of a pedigree to him, at least as of right now, especially as a 20-year-old compared to Glass, who's 25. Tibaru, I hope I said that correctly. If I didn't, I apologize. Asks, are you sure we'll see McGroarty in the NHL this season? There were reports that he would go back to Michigan this season, albeit before the trade. That's why the reports were there. He committed to going back to Michigan because he didn't want to play in the American Hockey League. He cannot go back to Michigan because he signed his 3-year ELC. So he is coming to Pittsburgh. He is going to play on the Penguins. He is going to be at the National Hockey League level. Ace80 asks, what could a return look like for a guy like Eller or Achari? Mostly draft picks. Mostly draft picks. And again, you'll have to see what the other team is at, where the other team is at, especially with salary cap space. If they're kind of up against it, it might include another player coming back, but I could see it being draft picks being the main thing that Kyle Dubas is looking for in exchange for guys like Eller or Achari. Again, Achari is going to be a little bit more difficult. $2 million for a fourth line guy that really didn't show any offensive upside last year, despite being very good at his other roles. Didn't show much offensive upside. Plus he has that extra year added on after this one. Whereas Eller, I mean, at this point, it's not technically a rental because you'd get him for the entire season, but he's on a 1-year contract. He was a third line guy last year. He's proven he could still be a third line guy, has that playoff pedigree, has a Stanley Cup ring under his belt. I could see the return being mainly draft picks. If you get a second, that would be phenomenal. I think it starts with a third as the best case scenario for a guy like Lars Eller. And again, it depends on the market, but that's where I think the market's at this current time. High Desert Biker says, at Tip of the Iceberg, which new player are you most excited about this year? It's hard to go away from McGroarty. It really is, because this is the guy that when you look at the rest of the offseason moves made by Kyle Dubas, they were all pieces that you're taking a gamble on, right? Anthony Beauvillier had a bad year, was traded twice. Can he recapture that? Same with Matt Grzelcyk, 2 bad years after the coaching change in Boston. Can he recapture what he had with Charlie McAvoy as a top line guy? Maybe. You're hoping for that. But the recent sample size hasn't shown much. So you're hoping that these guys who are 30 years old in Grzelcyk's case, Beauvillier is 27 years old. You're hoping that these guys can find it again in the back half of their career and can contribute in the bottom 6 or on the second pairing and lower, right? Same thing goes for the return of Ryan Shea, the return of Emil Bemstrom. So it's easy to say it's Rutger McGroarty. Outside of that, I'm going to say Cody Glass. I mean, this is a guy that was a first-round pick in 2017. It didn't work out when he was in Vegas. It didn't work out when he was in Nashville. If you can find whatever he had, especially whenever he was coming up through the amateur programs, he could be a really good bottom 6 piece for the Penguins. So again, it's a risk. It's a gamble. I'd go McGroarty 1, Glass 2. Those are the 2 that I'm looking at. And honestly, I'll throw in there the return of Alex Nedeljkovic as well. Not a new player, but a player that I think is going to have a little bit of a newer role. And again, I know he was the starting goaltender for the Penguins down the stretch last year, but I think going into this year compared to what he was going into last year, it's going to be a little bit of a different dynamic between him and Tristan Jarry, if that is indeed what the pairing is, the goaltending duo is when we get to the season. Logan Rose asks, do you think that the cap clearing will start after this to try and make sure the team is infused with youth? I think the team has already added a good bit of youth. And I think that there are opportunities, as you're alluding to here, to get even younger, right? Vasily Ponomarev, Ville Koivunen, Sam Poulin. I like Jonathan Gruden. I think he has been vastly under-talked about this entire summer. Those types of players, they're knocking on the door for the NHL. Now, there are roadblocks in front of them, but I think that comes as the season goes. I think the Penguins like what they have in these young players. I think the Penguins will love to see these young players graduate to the NHL level this year to infuse that young talent with the NHL team. But I do think that they know that there's a chance that some, if not all of those guys need a little bit more seasoning in the American Hockey League. Same goes for a guy like Joel Blomqvist between the pipes. He looked great last year. He's not quite there. He looks like he could be there, looks like he could play some NHL games this year, could be at that level, but he's not quite there. So you need a contingency plan in that instance. For the goaltender, it's hard to not put a bigger roadblock up because it's such an important position, hence the reason a 2-year deal at 2.5 for Alex Nedeljkovic. But some of these other players, if Beauvillier gets off to a hot start, if maybe not Kevin Hayes, he's on a 2-year contract, it'll be a little harder, but Lars Eller, Nola Chari, those types of guys, maybe your Rickard Rakell, I think that's going to be an interesting player to follow throughout the season, depending on where he goes and what the trade market looks like early in the season as things get going. Some of these players could be on their way out to make room for guys like Jesse Puljujärvi, who gets forgotten about a lot. Guys like Puustinen, who was asked about earlier. So I think that you do see those cap clearing moves. I think one of them is the center ice position that might come before training camp. But I think throughout the year, it's something to keep an eye on based on where the Penguins are at and based on where these prospects are at that are knocking on the door. Overall thoughts from TJ on the new members of the team. Like I said in that last answer, I think a lot of these players that were brought in, a lot of these new members of the team are guys that are going to come in and fill bottom 6 roles or bottom of the lineup roles. Guys like Sebastian Aho, not that one, obviously, but guys like Sebastian Aho, who's going to fight to be 7th defenseman, maybe even fight to get in there over Jack St. Ivany early in the season. I hope that's not the case, but again, good to bring competition into camp. But at the end of the day, I think Dubas did a lot of things well for a general manager that is trying to rebuild. He did a lot of those things. He added a lot of draft capital. He took on a couple of players that were, basically free, and Kevin Hayes, who's going to hopefully give you more offensive production, more point production from the bottom 6 than you've seen in the last couple of years. He got you Cody Glass, a guy who maybe a new situation unlocks what he had previously. So I like the moves and I like the new members of the team. I think outside of McGroarty, there are a lot of players that don't really elevate the ceiling of the team very much, but they do a good job of not letting the bottom fall out. That's really what I thought about the offseason up to this point. McGroarty obviously is a guy that if all things pan out, he elevates that ceiling in a very, very big way. Peter Swistock, Peter, you're taking in a lot of my content. I want to say I appreciate it. You were on the All Steelers Talk stream from 3:30 to 4:30. Now he's on this one. Appreciate you as always, Peter. Says, I know it's a long shot, but maybe Tanner Howe could fill Yager's shoes. It would take, similar to Yager, it would take some exponential steps forward here in his year 1 after draft. He's going to go back to the Regina Pats. Who knows? Maybe he gets traded because Regina's, I don't know how they're supposed to be this season. Last year, they were not really a playoff team. So maybe he gets traded. Maybe he goes to a contender and maybe he's able to elevate his game. But this is a guy that played with Connor Bedard, and Connor Bedard had a lot of very good things to say about Tanner Howe. He's similar to McGroarty as a guy that has that edge to him, which we all like. Can he fill his shoes? That's a tough task to ask a guy who is 2 years younger. But again, he's 2 years younger, so he has that time to try and come up and do that. And I'm still trying to find where I had, here it is, my top 10 prospects. By the way, Owen Pickering is at 5. I currently have Tanner Howe at 10. Could he raise up that list? Yes. Obviously, his first training camp is going to go a long way. The Prospects Challenge, which very intrigued to see if McGroarty participates in that. I feel like they might want to see him as much as possible, so there might be a chance that they do, but they might also say, you're coming here to play in the NHL. We don't need you going to that. So, I have Howe at 10. Could he move up that list? Certainly, he could. So it's going to take a lot for him to fill Yager's shoes right now. The good thing is you have a guy that filled Yager's shoes in Rutger McGroarty. Cameron Britton asks, man, you guys are rocking in the comment section. Appreciate everybody for tuning in. What players on the AHL team are you looking forward to watching this year? Team appears to be shaping up well. I'm excited about that team because it is a very young team this year. Last year, shout out to Tony Andrikaitis, who we look at for all of our AHL updates, all of our Wilkes-Barre Scranton updates. Go follow him on Twitter. If you haven't already, he'll provide the best coverage of Wilkes-Barre that you are going to get. Tony Andrikaitis was big on the, they're at their vet max. They're having to sit some guys because they have too many veteran players in accordance to the AHL guidelines. This year, that's not going to be a problem, right? They have a lot of young guys making their professional debuts, guys like Pickering, who I'm excited to see when he gets to go up against men for a full season, and guys like Tristan Brose. And talk about a guy who can quickly climb up the rankings and quickly make a name for himself. That's Tristan Brose, or Braz, or again, his name has been said multiple different times to me. So however you say it, very exciting. And then, of course, everybody's waiting to see where Sergei Murashov starts. If it's Murashov and Blomqvist, must-watch television. Must-watch television, no matter who's in net. Both of them are very exciting goaltending prospects. So I gave you 4 there. I will say, coming over to North America, after the numbers he put up in Russia, I'll put Murashov at the top of that list. But thank you for your question, Cameron. Neil is on the opposite side of this, is very disappointed that Yager is traded. Also, where does this put Bryan Rust? Is he tradable? Yeah, it stinks that Yager was there. I've talked about that a lot. This does nothing for Bryan Rust. Rutger McGroarty's a left wing / center, can play center. Bryan Rust is a right wing. He's still the best winger the Penguins have, the most proven winger the Penguins have. Not to mention, he does have a full no movement clause. I believe that ends after this season. It moves down to a 10-team or a 15-team no trade list, but he has a full no movement clause. The Penguins have no interest in shipping off Bryan Rust. He's still giving you terrific production from a very manageable cap hit. So I don't think this has any implication on Bryan Rust. I think, in fact, it probably helps him knowing that going into the season, it was going to be O'Connor. Now it's McGroarty, who is a little bit better when it comes to the facilitating aspect of things and the setup aspect of things. Again, not trying to dump on O'Connor. I'm very excited for him and his role going into this season. So, but at the same time, the upside is there for McGroarty to potentially facilitate for Sid, facilitate for Rust, and obviously be on the receiving end of things as well. And potentially adding a little bit of that net front presence as well, if I can talk. Let's go down here. Broder says, is there dates for training camp? Not as of yet. We would assume it's going to be mid-September, typically between the 15th and the 20th. It depends on the year. Before that, the prospects will come into town. They'll have a couple days of practice and get ready to go out and participate in the Prospects Challenge, which I could get you the dates for that, which should tell us about when the NHL camp will start. The Prospects Challenge is September 13th to the 16th. So I would have to imagine that following week is when camp starts. So right after September 16th, at some point, they have not released a full schedule to this point. Mac Brunson says, would you be willing, if you were the general manager, to trade first-round picks for top prospects? Because essentially, you'd be buying a player such as Cutter Gauthier for a pick. Typically, yes. The problem with that, Mac, is typically they're not available, right? Typically, other teams are going to want to say, you know what? Our top prospect, he's developed under us. He's looking good. We're excited for him. But we want to restart that clock with a first-round pick. And I understand it. If I'm the GM and that's available, like it was in this instance, yeah, I want to be in on that. I'm sure, honestly, I'm sure at least 15 teams had called and inquired about the asking price for Rutger McGroarty. I'm sure everybody was in on it because it typically doesn't happen. Maybe it happens more. You mentioned Cutter Gauthier. That was the first of its kind, which was absolutely ridiculous mid-season last year. We see it now with Rutger McGroarty. Does it happen more often? Potentially. You always call and ask. And if it's a first-round pick, essentially you're saying you drafted him first overall when they're 18, 19, and 20 years old. You take that, especially whenever you're at this point that the Penguins are at, where they want some proven commodities to come in and infuse young talent right away. They did a lot of that last year. Talent that is near NHL ready. McGroarty's NHL ready. And that's why they went out and got him. Pittsburgh Heather says, what odds do you give both Eller and Achari being on the roster opening night? It's hard to predict because, again, where are other teams right now? McGroarty was a loose thread of this offseason. It had to be tied up because he wasn't going to play for Winnipeg. But most teams, you're seeing PTOs sign now. Most teams have an idea of what they want to see in training camp. I think when you see one of these trades happen, it will be if something happens or if a team is unhappy with where they're at in training camp. So for that reason, I'm going to say both of them being on the roster opening night, I'm going to give that like a 75 to 78% chance. I don't know why I said 78, 80% chance, because I do think that there is a chance they get moved, but I also know that there's a lot of teams that are waiting to see what they have. And if they like what they have, or if they're not willing to part with what the Penguins want to get back in return at that time, then I can see the other teams saying, you know what, not right now. And I could see the Penguins going into the season with both Eller and Achari, but both of them probably being in trade discussions all year long. Pittsburgh Heather Eyes, another question here asking, what happens with Jesse Puljujärvi? Is he in the AHL all year or a 13th forward? I liked what I saw from Puljujärvi last year. I think that, honestly, he deserves an opportunity to fight for an NHL roster spot. I don't know if he gets it on the right side. It is a stacked right side, especially, if Glass earns a spot, especially if they want to keep Eller up there, or they keep Eller as well, because they're not going to send down Achari. They're not going to send down Kevin Hayes. So unfortunately, Puljujärvi ends up being the odd man out or the 13th forward. But on my roster that I had there, the lineup that I put out there, and you might disagree with it, but on that lineup, Beauvillier wasn't in the lineup. Pustin wasn't in the lineup. Poulin wasn't in the lineup. Neither was Puljujärvi. So there's a lot of names. It's going to be very busy, very hectic at training camp, but it's going to be very interesting. Who can separate themselves? That's going to be the biggest question mark for everybody. This puts Puljujärvi in a position where he has to earn his spot. I mean, he was given a 2-year deal last year because they liked where he was at, but wanted to give him more of an extended runway into this season. He's going to have to earn everything he gets this year. And it stinks because I thought he earned an opportunity with the way he performed last year. But again, this is a team that right now is in an awkward situation. They're rebuilding, yet they're trying to compete as best as they can. It's a tough one. I would like to see Puljujärvi get an opportunity, but again, he's going to have to go out there like pretty much everybody else in the bottom six, and he's going to have to earn it. And maybe one of those roadblocks gets taken out of the way, but he's still going to have to beat out players that you mentioned later in Koivunen, Poulin, Ponomarev, Tristan Brose, who I think is probably not somebody you expect to see this season. And if you do, it's probably really late in the season as well. Brian says, only chance for a Jari trade is an unfortunate goalie injury for a contending team. I don't know if it's necessarily just an unfortunate injury for a contending team, because there are some teams that made their trades this offseason, might not like where they're at. There are some teams that might want an upgrade. There are teams that could be considered lottery teams right now. They get off to a hot start, and, well, it'd be nice if we had another goaltender, right? Teams like the Chicago Blackhawks, who understandably have not been good the last 2 seasons. That's why they netted themselves Connor Bedard and then another high pick last year. But if they end up going out there with the new pieces they added, Tyler Bertuzzi, Teuvo Teravainen, they have a young defense. If they go out there and they outperform, maybe they want a goaltender as well. So there are some opportunities. There are some scenarios that could lead to a Tristan Jarry trade, not just an unfortunate goalie injury, although that one is included as well. Let's go see any other questions here before we go. Let's see. With the addition of Rutger McGroarty, what is your personal opinion on what the forward line should be? Answered that before, but if you were not on the live at that point, I'll bring it up again. This is what I have as of right now. And again, very rough. We haven't seen half these players play in Pittsburgh. Some of them probably don't even know what Cranberry is as of yet. So this is a very rough draft of what the lines could be in my eyes if I was Mike Sullivan. McGroarty, new guy, with Crosby and Rust. Michael Bunting, Evgeny Malkin, Ricard Raquel, just run that back from last year. Drew O'Connor with Lars Eller and Kevin Hayes. Blake Lizotte with Cody Glass and Noel Acciari. That's what I have there for the Penguins as of right now. Bonehead, again, throws in another comment here. Appreciate you as always. Says, thanks for reading my comment, Mr. Belsky. Appreciate you. Says, disappointed we couldn't have gotten Ehlers and McGroarty. That was the dream. That was the dream. We had brought that up a couple of different times, and I was hoping, I thought that it was going to cost a first-round pick, probably another pick, probably another top prospect, even though I thought back then that Brayden Yager was untouchable. Turns out he was not. What would they have had to throw in to get Nikolai Ehlers? But then again, you add Ehlers, you look at that left side of Ehlers, McGroarty, who is NHL ready now, Michael Bunting, Drew O'Connor. I mean, that's where the list ends, right? Sorry, Beauvillier, you're Hinostroza, you're back down. Sorry. No, I'd still try to trade somebody and get Blake Lizotte bumped over to center, or at the very least, keep him at the NHL level. I'm excited to see what he has. But it would have been very nice if the Penguins went out and got Nikolai Ehlers as well. I think if they were 2 years ago, Penguins, and this situation was just dropped into 2022, and Kyle Dubas was, again, a lot of ifs here, and Kyle Dubas was there and not Ron Hextall, maybe they are willing to part with that many assets, because the Penguins were a playoff team back then. They were a team that should have beaten the Rangers in 2022, and they were a team that needed better goaltending, but you could have also said any additions to the forward core like Ehlers and McGroarty would have been absolutely huge. But again, that's a lot of ifs. That's a lot of revisionist history. I was hoping the same thing, Bonehead, but unfortunately didn't come to pass. Jinx says, do you think the Penguins make the playoffs? I think they're a bubble team, and that opinion won't change. They're a team that going into the season, when I look at the Metro, and we'll talk about this next week, actually, so you're looking into the future with me. We're going to talk about this next week. The Metro, I see it being the Rangers, who obviously take a step back from President's Trophy, but still among the top three, and this is in no particular order. The Rangers, the Devils, I think, are going to take another step back up, and then the Carolina Hurricanes. I think the Penguins are fighting with about 4 or 5 teams for those last 2 wildcard spots. Will they get that? Again, contingent upon a lot of questions being answered. What does the defense look like? Huge one. What does the goaltending look like? Another huge one. What does the power play look like with David Quinn? There's a lot of questions for the Penguins. I think they have a ceiling of being a playoff team for certain, but I also think that things could go wrong like they did last year, and they end up on the outside looking in for a 3rd consecutive season. Negative pressure products. We only got a couple more here. Negative pressure products or productions, says, does John Ludwig get ice time this year? He's going to fight for it. And honestly, I think the coaching staff really likes him. He brings something that all of a sudden the Penguins have a little bit more of. Bunting brings some of that, a little bit of nastiness. You look at McGroarty, brings a little bit more of that nastiness. I want Drew O'Connor, such a nice kid. I want Drew O'Connor to get a little bit more nasty this year, but hopefully he does. Brings a little bit more nastiness. Malkin, obviously, when he wants to. In moderation would be nice, but we all know Red missed Malkin. But John Ludwig brings something that those guys don't, and that's knuckles, right? He brings a guy that he's willing to go out there and fight for anybody on the team, which the Penguins have not had in a player in a long time. I think Ludwig gets an opportunity, although it is getting very crowded. I mentioned that they went out and signed another left shot defenseman earlier today. Nikolai, I'm going to make sure I get his name right. Nikolai Nizev, a player that was under David Quinn in San Jose the last 4 seasons, has 81 games of NHL experience under his belt. Ludwig's going to have to beat him out. Sebastian Aho is still there. Ryan Shea's brought back. Alexei Ivany's there. There's a lot of names. I mean, Philip Kral was brought in, a former Dubas product in Toronto. So it's going to be tough. He's going to have to beat some guys out. And we don't know where he's at health-wise. We haven't gotten an update since his surgery. The initial timetable was that he would be getting back right around the middle of training camp. If things go faster and he can have a full camp, maybe he earns one of those NHL spots out of camp. I don't know about starting, but certainly as a 7th defenseman, he's looked like he's earned that, as the Penguins officially, as of this moment, announced their signing of Rutger McGroarty to a 3-year ELC. They announced the trade about an hour and a half earlier. Let's finish it off with this one. Cole Lunger says, one last question. Are you worried about McGroarty's rumored attitude issues? I've seen nothing of the sort. Outside of him wanting out of Winnipeg for disagreements of his development path, this guy was the captain of Team USA last year. This guy was one of the leaders of Michigan last year. You know, if people want to get upset about the fact that he didn't agree with some NHL front office members about what's best for him, okay. You know, he fought his way out of a situation, and I understand that's going to come with people thinking that he has attitude issues, but this is a guy that, as Kyle Dubas mentioned in that introductory, statement about McGroarty, this guy brings a lot of leadership. This guy is very highly thought of in a lot of circles. And especially with Mike Sullivan being as in-tuned as he is with USA Hockey, being the head coach of the Four Nations Face-Off and the head coach of the Olympics coming up, McGroarty was a big U.S. National Development Program guy. He was obviously, I mentioned, Captain America. I think Mike Sullivan would have inquired about that whenever the feelers were going out about Rutger McGroarty. So I don't have any issues about that. And even if he did have some, which I haven't seen, like I mentioned, step into a locker room with Evgeny Malkin, Sidney Crosby, Chris Letang, that humbles people pretty quickly. And I think he'll get in line if he wasn't already. But again, I don't foresee that being an issue at all. That's going to do it for this live episode talking about a massive trade for the Penguins. Thank you to everybody that tuned in live at Tip of the Ice-Burgh. Remember, you can find us both on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh or anywhere you get your podcast from. Appreciate everybody tuning in. We'll see you guys next time.